Charles Sanson, 1635 to 1707, was the founder of a dynasty of executioners, which included 7 generations who administered justice for almost 160 years. He received the title of executioner along with his wife's dowry when he married the daughter of the Rouen executioner. The thing is, according to custom, if the executioner had no son, his son-in-law had to become the executioner. Charles Sanson himself was from a noble family, and his ancestors had participated in the Crusades. While attending an execution carried out by his father-in-law, he fainted at the sight. But he quickly got used to it and became known as a master of his craft. In 1688, after the death of his wife, Charles Sanson became the chief executioner of Paris by decree of Louis XIV. Interesting fact: in order not to break the dynasty of the Sanson executioners, Charles Baptiste Sanson was forced to take up the position after his father's death. When he was only 8 years old, Baptiste Sanson began to perform his direct duties. Only when he grew up, but he was required to be present at executions carried out by another executioner. Albert Pierpont, 1905 to 1992, famous English executioner, innkeeper, and writer. Master of the gallows. On average, Albert Pierpont carried out an execution in 17 seconds. On May 8, 1951, Albert Pierpont executed murderer James Ingley in 7.5 seconds. However, the speed of the execution was greatly influenced by the condemned man himself, who, according to the executioner's assistant Sid Durnley Ingley, literally ran to the gallows, urging everyone on. This record was included in the Guinness Book of Records at the time. Albert Pierpont's father and uncle were also executioners. His father died of alcoholism. On his uncle's advice, Albert never drank before an execution. Pierpont began his career as an executioner in September 1932 as an assistant executioner. In October 1941, he carried out his first execution as an executioner, which took him 12 seconds. During his career as an executioner, he carried out between 435 and 600 executions, according to conservative estimates. In December 1941, he executed German spy Karl Richter, who resisted execution and even managed to remove the noose from his neck when Pierpont opened the trapdoor beneath his feet with a lever. The noose caught on his nose, but his cervical vertebrae were still broken. In his book, Albert Pierpont called this execution the most difficult of his career as an executioner. In between executions, Pierpont delivered groceries to stores in a truck. The post-war years were the peak of Pierpont's career. He carried out executions of war criminals and was also invited to European countries to carry out executions. He was called the People's Avenger. He was recognized on the streets and often shaken hands with. Albert Pierpont was supposed to execute Nazi criminals after the Nuremberg trials, but this job went to another executioner, who is also featured in this video. In 1949, he executed the famous serial killer John Haig, also known as the London Vampire. At the end of the 1940s, Pierpont rented a space and opened a pub. From that moment on, he no longer delivered groceries to stores, but instead served beer to pub patrons between executions. And there was no shortage of customers at that time. The public's love faded as quickly as it had come. On July 13, 1955, he executed Ruth Ellis. A 28-year-old woman was sentenced to death by hanging for the murder of her lover, David Blakely. Ruth Ellis' execution sparked a wave of protests by feminists demanding the abolition of the death penalty for women. They demand equal rights with men, but at the same time insist on the abolition of the death penalty for women, which is illogical, as Albert Pierpoint commented on these protests. Feminists in Great Britain considered him their number one enemy. People often shouted insults at him on the street. In 1956, he ended his career as an executioner and focused on his pub. In the same year, the Home Office recognised Albert Pierpoint as the best executioner in British history. In the early 1970s, Pierpoint sold his drinking business and began writing his memoirs. The book was later published, and readers highly praised the former executioner's writing skills. The money that the book's publishers paid him and his wife was enough for a comfortable retirement. Albert Pierpoint spent the last 4 years of his life in a nursing home with his wife. The couple had no children. Richard Brandon, 1600 to 1649, famous London executioner. He inherited the title of executioner from his father, Gregory Brandon. Richard Brandon first worked as his father's assistant executioner and replaced him around 1639. In 1641, he was convicted of bigamy. The charges were later dropped. It is believed that Richard Brandon executed Charles I in 1649, but this is difficult to prove as the executioner who executed the king was wearing a mask. He died on June 20, 1649. Vasily Blokhin, 1895–1955, he became famous after his death, during the years of Perestroika, as the chief executioner of Stalin's repressions. According to many historians, Blokhin personally shot between 10,000 and 50,000 people during his career. There were times when he shot 200 people a day. One eyewitness described Blokhin preparing to execute prisoners, and then I saw all this horror. Blokhin put on his special clothes, a brown leather cap, a long brown leather apron, and brown leather gloves with cuffs above the elbows. It made a huge impression on me. I saw the executioner. Vasily Blokhin liked to carry out executions with a German Walther PP pistol. A dark period in Blokhin's life began after Stalin's death. In April 1953, he was dismissed from the MGB for health reasons. Then, in November 1954, he was stripped of his rank, as unworthy of bearing the title of general, and all his awards. On February 3, 1955, Blokhin died of a heart attack, but for another reason: he shot himself. Giovanni Battista Bugatti, 1779–1869, was the executioner of the Papal States. During his career, which lasted from 1796 to 1865, he executed approximately 515 people. He mainly used the guillotine. Giovanni Bugatti was forbidden to leave his neighborhood of Trastevere, except for matters related to his work. Therefore, when he crossed the bridge of Saint Angel, everyone knew that another execution was about to take place. In between executions, he and his wife sold umbrellas to tourists. The couple had no children. The death penalty in Rome was abolished a year after the death of Giovanni Battista Bugatti. John Woods, 1911–1950, was a U.S. Army sergeant and American executioner who became famous for executing war criminals at the Nuremberg and Tokyo military tribunals. According to Woods himself, before the war he carried out death sentences in one of the U.S. prisons. After being drafted into the U.S. Army, he volunteered to execute American soldiers and officers who had committed serious crimes while on duty. Although Albert Pierpoint, who was famous for his quick and efficient executions, was supposed to execute the war criminals of the Nuremberg trials, this task was instead entrusted to John Woods, who, according to many eyewitnesses, carried out the executions in an extremely unprofessional manner that was painful for those being executed. For example, Wilhelm Keitel died by hanging after 20 minutes of agony. John Woods died from an accidental electric shock. Before the war, he was married and had no children. Clement Henri Sanson, 1739–1806, was the last executioner in the Sanson dynasty. During his career, he executed approximately 2,918 people. During the French Revolution, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were sent to his guillotine. Although Sanson initially refused to execute them, he was eventually forced to carry out the executions. Clement Henri Sanson ended his career as an executioner in a rather unusual way. He was unemployed for a long time, and his debts were growing. He had no choice but to pawn the guillotine, for which the moneylender gave him 3,000 francs. A few days later, an order came in. Sanson went to the moneylender and asked to borrow the guillotine for a few hours, but the moneylender refused. As a result, Sanson was fired. Thus, the greed of one moneylender brought an end to a dynasty of executioners that had lasted 7 generations.
The press said she wept and cried when she was going to the scaffold, and she said something to me just before she died. That was in the press. She never spoke to me.
She came to you?
She came.